The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said this Tuesday that American military aid on its way to Ukraine would make a real difference on the battlefield. America's top diplomat made an unannounced visit to Kyiv to reassure an ally facing a fierce new Russian offensive. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky immediately repeated his call for more air defences to help his troops cope in the face of increased Russian attacks and weapons production. Well, we'll be speaking with Peter Zalmayev of the European Democracy Initiative after this report by Monty Francis.
An embrace between Antony Blinken and Ukraine's foreign minister, followed by a working lunch at a pizzeria in Kyiv. One in a whirlwind of meetings for the U.S. Secretary of State, who also met with Ukraine's prime minister and with the nation's president on his fourth visit to the country since Russia launched its full-scale invasion. After his flurry of meetings and a speech directed at the Ukrainian public, Blinken made assurances that American military equipment was on its way after President Biden signed a $61 billion aid package last month that had been delayed by Republicans in the U.S. Congress.
I have come to Ukraine with a message. You are not alone. The United States has been by your side from day one. We are with you today, and we will stay by your side until Ukraine's security, its sovereignty, its ability to choose its own path is guaranteed.
Blinken's visit to Kyiv comes as Russia continues to make advances in the east and as Ukraine struggles to fend off attacks from Moscow. The latest violence coming to Ukraine's second-largest city, Kyiv, where Russian strikes damaged a high-rise residential building on Tuesday and as rescuers scrambled to evacuate the most vulnerable. For Ukraine's president, American aid cannot arrive fast enough. While thankful for what he called the crucial help, Zelensky said air defense was currently the biggest problem for Ukraine and requested 2 Patriot surface-to-air missile systems for the Kharkiv region.
Not simple period for Ukraine and a tough period for the east of our country, for our warriors. Thank you that you came, especially these days, to support Ukraine.
Blinken did not respond to that specific request for air defenses, but said that some American aid had already arrived and would make a real difference on the battlefield.
Monty Francis, let's go straight to Peter Zalmayev from the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, joining us live from Kyiv. Peter, great to see you. Hope you're keeping well. The circumstances, of course, remain difficult from the very first time we spoke back in February 2023 to the present day. When you heard Blinken was visiting, when you saw what was developing, how did you see this visit? What's your interpretation of what's been going on?
Well, Antony Blinken is a colorful person. You know, he showed up at a pizza parlor. He then played the guitar at my favorite neighborhood bar. Imagine that. You know, it actually raised a few eyebrows. You know, people were asking what exactly the point of that is. You know, we are very, thankful, obviously, to the administration. We're thankful to Secretary Blinken personally, but we also understand that whatever assurances that the administration gives may be out the window if, let's say, their competitor, the Republican candidate wins in November. Then, we are very much aware that anything can change. And, testimony to that was this 6-month period that Congress prevaricated, vacillated. We didn't get the weapons, and as a result, you see the Russians are trying to press their advantage in the east and in the north, which makes the price eventually higher. That when the U.S. decides to finally step in and Congress decides to act, the price has gone up higher. The Russians are acting more, brazenly now. And all of a sudden we're having to defend more territory. We're losing more lives. And the city of Kharkiv is actually in risk of having to evacuate. Thank God it's not going to happen in the next week or so. But if the Russians are within, let's say, 10 kilometers of Kharkiv, that would mean that it's reachable to their, regular regular shells.
Hearing that completely, Peter, our correspondence in Vovshuk, which has been getting hit very heavily by the Russians, exactly what you're talking about. And that's within reach, firing power of getting to Kharkiv. So clearly the threat there is very high. Blinken saying that this $61 billion amount of money released as part of Biden's plan will make an immediate difference on the battlefield. That is a rather ambitious thing to say, is it not? Because getting it from Congress to weapons to the battlefield, it's not an overnight process, is it?
It's not an overnight process. I mean, it's already taking a few weeks, and the Czech Republic's initiative to supply as many as million shells to Ukraine, we're seeing dribs and drabs of it. It's not fully there, and the Russians know where those points, the entry points, are. They've actually promised to target them. So there's that risk as well, and so as you mentioned in your report, right now the crucial requirement is to boost our air defenses to protect Kharkiv. Zelensky mentioned two systems we need. Otherwise, we talk about evacuation of almost 1.5 million people. That would exacerbate the already very, very tense situation in Ukraine.
There are systems coming. There are things being promised. France is among those promising more weapons too. Peter, there are some people, let me just put this to you as a kind of counter-argument. Some people would say that when we first spoke back in February 2022, would you have perhaps accepted what you have now as a good outcome? Is it perhaps time for Ukraine to reassess what it does, how it approaches this, and perhaps do a deal with Russia?
You see, the thing is, the deal is not on the table. I mean, contrary to what you are hearing from different corners of, you should just go and to the Telegram channels of, for example, Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's former president, and you'll see Russia's true position, not the hints that the Russians are dropping. Putin is not willing to negotiate with Ukraine, first of all, directly. He will only negotiate as equals with the Americans, and only on terms that are essentially capitulation of Ukraine. That is very simple. It's just simply not on the table. Whatever you hear, negotiations at best, if we can stave off this Russian attack for the foreseeable future, we can reach a ceasefire. But once again, and I've said it time and again, on France 24 and other channels, Vladimir Putin, for as long as he's alive, he will continue being obsessed about Ukraine. Ukraine will either cease to exist as a viable entity or be annexed to Russia, which is what essentially has happened to Belarus, which has lost its true independence.
So in terms of what we're hearing, of course, you rightly point out there's no deal on the table. I was putting that question forward as a devil's advocate kind of thing, because many people say this without really thinking, reflecting on what the reality is for people in Ukraine. I'm wondering how you feel about, well, when Blinken says you're not alone, when Macron says Ukraine must win, when David Cameron, Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, says, you will have the missiles to strike into Russia. How do you feel when Germany says, well, you can have the weapons, but you can't use them for certain things? They put conditions on the weapons that they give to you. What do you think of Germany's stance?
That's exactly what I said earlier. It's increasing the eventual price. Western powers do come around to these tough decisions, but it takes time, and we lose the precious time while Vladimir Putin is rebuilding its military machine like there's no tomorrow. He is really, really concentrating on building it back up, and while we are essentially letting him roll over more and more of Ukraine's territory. This so-called Russian sanctuary doctrine, which is like Russians are able to use their territory for strikes on Ukraine. This has cost us dearly. If the Western powers had been a little more courageous and more decisive and given us these long-range weapons, including the Taurus missile, the Taurus missiles, and the ATACMS missiles, we would have disabled the Russian firing power a long time ago. We would have been in a very different place from now.
So in a sense, is it fair to say, in a kind of like boxing analogy, Ukraine's fighting with one arm tied behind its back? This is what you're facing, really. Not only are you outnumbered and outgunned, but you've got one arm tied behind your back.
That's the handicap, exactly. That's exactly what we're talking about. Russia has the luxury of waging this war exclusively on Ukraine's territory, and if Ukraine hadn't stepped up its, drone program, we would not have had any means to make it hurt inside Russia's territory. And all these, limitations that you mentioned on Ukraine using long-range weapons make it a very uneven and very unfair fight.
We know that Kharkiv at this moment in time, Peter, is suffering and coming in for a repeated Russian attack. Now, I know, because you've told me that you are from the Donbass, which of course is very much the battlefront. Can you give us any sense of how things are there right now? We know it's been a war of attrition for over a year. What is going on there right now?
Well, in fact, I have some of my relatives that are living just across the front line there. They are, stubbornly refusing to move, and they're already pretty much in the firing zone. So this is very personal for me. It's very concerning, to say the least. That's part of what you're seeing in Kharkiv, actually, that most of my colleagues and most military experts will say that Russians at this point are not really hoping to capture Kharkiv. They lack the requisite strength, but they're trying to distract the Ukrainian forces and to stretch them thin so that there's not adequate defense precisely of the Donbass, Chasiv Yar, which is commanding heights. There in that region. If Russians capture that, they will move much closer to Vladimir Putin's original goal, and that is to control the entire, area of the Donbass. I think that remains his, near-term priority.
And as Volodymyr Zelensky said about 24 hours ago, it's a question of now Ukraine being hit on two fronts. This is trying to stretch Ukraine's forces as far as possible so Russia can take advantage. As I understand, advancing in smaller groups to create that kind of chaotic reaction.
Exactly, and that's actually also raising questions of Ukraine's preparedness. Why, if we had known this all along, that this offensive was coming this summer, why whole stretches of the territory remain unmined and with the poor defense lines? I mean, this is a debate raging inside Ukraine, and there's a lot of blame game going on. So this is not to sugarcoat it. We're really also having issues to deal with as far as preparedness.
It wouldn't be like you, Peter, to sugarcoat any issue. You speak very frankly, and that's what we appreciate about you. Did the delay in the funding from Congress come into that? Do you think, did that affect getting prepared?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, on just the very basic, 155 millimeter shell. I mean, that's something we ran out of, and Russians were able to reach 10-to-1 advantage in just firing power, and that's unheard of. Obviously, we lack the strength in the skies. We're waiting for those F-16s. They probably won't come in the numbers sufficient to do this, but the artillery, which remains the god of war, and the general sort of you have to consider the general morale, fighting spirit when Ukraine's most reliable, at least up till now, and biggest partner, vacillated for 6 months. That obviously did not do anything to boost our morale.
Peter Zalmayev, thank you very much indeed for sharing your assessment with us. We always appreciate your time, sir. Peter Zalmayev of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Stay safe, sir, over there in Kyiv. Pleasure to have you on France 24, as always. Thank you to Peter. That was our apropos feature focusing on the situation in Ukraine. We take a very short break.